The big ideas which influence education. We all have these ideas inside of us, but sometimes we don't recognize them. Now, the story of education can be told from 2 points of view. It can be told from 3 points of view. It can be told from 4 points of view, 5 points of view. There are many perspectives on schooling, many perspectives on the best way to teach and the best way to learn. We are going to talk about 2 ways, and then we're going to talk about 3 ways, and we're going to talk about 4 ways. But before we begin that, we're going to draw a timeline, and we're going to show the ebb and flow of these ideas throughout time. So if you're working with me, what I'd like to ask you to do is take a piece of paper and just draw a line straight across it. This is our timeline of the last, let's think in terms of the last 100 years. So over there on the left you have 1900, and over here on the right for you we have 2000. And if you're drawing a timeline, what I want you to do first, of course, put yourself in. When were you born? Put your year in there. 1944 for me. Think in terms of your parents. Where do they fit in the timeline? Kind of just scribble a little bit. Think in terms of your Grammy and Grampy. Where do they fit in your timeline? I have a timeline of the last 100 years, and we're going to talk about the ebb and flow of the big ideas of education. But you'll notice right away I put World War I in, World War II, got those in there, put 1950 in there, 80, 90, 2000. Right now let's put 1957 in, Sputnik. Some of Chomsky's early work. Those were big years. 1957 was one of those pivotal times in history. I was a student in a little elementary school in northern South Dakota. I remember when Sputnik went off. I remember thinking, oh no, I'm not working hard enough. I'm not learning fast enough. I'm not studying hard enough. I must be more diligent. Pitiful, isn't it? I was a little kid. But there was such a national outcry that, oh, horrors, the Russians are getting ahead of us. And it was a time of major change in education. But it came down to me as if I have to work harder. Okay, let's think of 1900. What was happening in 1900 in the United States? Let's just think about it a little bit. Okay, let's go back a little bit farther. Go to 1850. In your brain, focus on 1850. I'm willing to bet most of you somewhere in your head have Industrial Revolution popping out. What was happening 1850, 1860 in the United States? We were building a country. We were building factories. We were building railroads. You think of that. You think about steel going clear across the United States. That's phenomenal. When we built our nation, the perspective, the approach, the big idea was called scientific management. Scientific management meant that if you were one of those men in a factory, or if you were one of those men building a railroad, all of your work was measurable, quantifiable, and you were paid per unit. And it worked. We built a nation. Then about 1900, people in the United States said, okay, we got our factories, we got our nation, we got our railroads, what's next? They got to thinking about, I know, we need schools. What are we going to do about schools? Thus, the national dialogue started in the early 1900s. What should we do? Well, there was one large body of thought, which of course thought, I know, it worked in building factories, it worked in building railroads, it worked in building our country. Maybe we should just morph scientific management into schools. We will quantify everything. We will measure everyone's work. They will get pay grades based on per work unit. So scientific management morphed into what we eventually started to call in schools, 1920s, behaviorism. And you've all studied it, you've all lived it, and names Watson, Taylor, we all know the names, emerged. As behaviorism emerged, things like memorization became important. However, what I want you to know is at the same time, there was another idea. So we had simultaneous, very much opposite ideas. 1900, led by John Dewey. Do we love him? John Dewey was thinking, well, we need schools. What should we do? He felt we learn by doing. He felt we learn whole to parts. He felt a child's experience was how we learned, and he had a totally different point of view than those in behaviorism. So what we had happening in 1900s, 1910, 1920s, these two oppositional ideas evolved. Okay, for our purposes today, we're going to look at the top ideas. And for our purposes, I'm going to call this the official school of thought, the official theory of teaching and learning. Think of it this way, top down. Think of official. It was scientific management when we built our nation. It evolved into our schools. We called it behaviorism. And it lasted in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s. Remember, I'm a child in school now. In the 50s, behaviorism. You've all studied it. You know about the black box theory. You put something into the stimulus into the black box, we can predict the reaction from it. We quantified, we measured, we memorized. The official theory of learning, the official approach to teaching and learning has been the dominant idea for the last 100 plus years. It was the school of thought, it was the theory, it was the perspective that won the argument of the day. The oppositional idea was called progressivism, led by John Dewey. It really has been, throughout the last 100 years, more of a minority idea. It was not as dominant, but all of us have had some experiences with it, where we learn by doing, and eventually it got into World War I, World War II, and we in the United States, progressivism, we were influenced to a certain extent by something over in Germany, Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. That was a very dialectical, dialogical approach to teaching and learning. We learn through dialogue with each other. That, of course, joined with progressivism. About 1950s, Piaget was really beginning to be listened to, and he was our cognitivist. And for many purposes, I would say Piaget is very much a bridge between the official theory of learning and the progressivism on the bottom. Let's us call the classical theory of learning, learn by doing. And very much Piaget, 1950s, 1960s, we can think of him as a bridge between the two. Okay, my first teaching job was 1966. And in 1966, I went from the prairies of South Dakota, a small little school, to teach in Philadelphia. And I will never forget it. I had Spanish 1, 2, 3, and 4 in high school. Every single wall in that school was made of glass. So you could stand here and look out to every single class. It was a very elite school, very enlightened school, very much a high-income area of the community. I remember I would be able to see in my first year of teaching the principal when he walked down the hall. I remember mostly his suits. I'm sure his suits cost more than my entire wardrobe. That's what I remember. But we could see him coming. And when I hit Philadelphia, I remember those Spanish books. I had 25 or 28 or 30 of Spanish 1, Spanish 2, Spanish 3, Spanish 4. It was pure behaviorism to Spanish, pure memory work. And I'm sure those students who were my students, some of them still can spout those dialogues because they had to memorize them. Now, we were useless in Mexico, you understand. We couldn't do real conversation, but we sounded good, and the students sounded good. But I remember, that was 1966, and me thinking, this isn't going to work. I'm going to look great, students are going to look great, and in half a dozen years, they're going to be useless in Spanish. But behaviorism was king. Okay, I continued to teach. Okay, we're about the 1980s, and there's this breath of fresh air, and I have to thank Piaget. I remember saying to a student named Jose, I said, Jose, he was 8th grader. He was sitting in the back of the room. I said, I'm reading this journal article, and it says here, there's a guy who's saying, we no longer have to memorize only. Now we get to think. Cognitivism? And I remember Jose telling the class, and the class of 8th graders cheering. So in the early 80s, and I was teaching madly during that time, words like cognitivism began to emerge, words like interactionist. Cognitivism soon started to be slipping into constructivism. We build knowledge together. Constructivism started to be tied to social, cultural contexts of teaching and learning. These were great years for me. In the 80s, these were great years for me. Until about 1990, 89, 90, 91, I was teaching in Texas then. And what I remember, these fabulous, experienced teachers who had fabulous classroom with kids talking and building their knowledge together and learning, and the principal would walk in and those teachers would suddenly go to direct instruction. They would talk and students would listen, and I would say, what are you doing? And they'd say, this is what the state of Texas wants us to do. That was 89, 90, and as you know, No Child came along 1991. It swept the nation. 90 on there, I personally had hopes for social cultural context of teaching and learning, and we went straight back to behaviorism, straight back to, it was No Child Left Behind is what was instituted then. It was back to the basics. That's where we were. It was an amazing thing. From my point of view, it was a controlled approach to language, and if you can control kids' language, you can control thought. Now, look at the classical approach to teaching and learning. We know now that the official approach really came from how we built our nation. My question is, where did the classical, learn by doing approach to teaching and learning come from? It evolved out of the early work of Lev Vygotsky, who looked at the social, cultural, political context of teaching and learning, but of the late 1800s, early 1900s, particularly 1920s, 1930s. I think he died in 31. But then where did Lev Vygotsky get his ideas? He reached way back to the sages of the ages. His ideas are tied directly to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, you know, Socratic dialogue. We learn from dialogue with each other. So the classical approach to teaching and learning, progressivism, very much springs from the sages of the ages. The official approach springs from how we built our nation. So when people in the public, or any of us, say, well, we need to do it back to the basics, the standards, discrete point testing. The reason they say that is they say that because that's all they've known. That's all their mom and dad knew. That's all their Grammy and Grampy knew. But if you look in the big historical context, there are many ways to teaching and learning. Where the future is going, it's true, I don't know. I do not know the future. We are on a precipice, so I'll tell you that. No Child is ending right now. Race to the Top looks more punitive, more tests, more what is called verification of students' learning. It looks very frightening to me. But what I want you to know is this argument between part to whole hold apart between official memorization and classical, meaning-centered teaching and learning has been around a long time. And it's not an argument just in the United States today. It's been going on forever. It's more than a 100-year argument.